Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Demystifying Clinical Trials, What Patients Need to Know, which is a joint partnership between THANC, ThyCa, and SPOHNC. We're so glad you're here as we work together to bring clarity and confidence to a topic that can often feel overwhelming. Today, you'll hear from a medical expert who will walk us through how clinical trials work and cancer survivors who will show us what participation really involves and how to think through whether a trial might be right for you. Our goal is to provide practical guidance, clear explanations, and real-world perspective so you leave feeling more informed and supported in your decision-making. We'd also like to take a moment to recognize the sponsors of today's webinar. ASI and Bicara for their generous support of our mission. Their shared commitment to empowering patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals plays a vital role in advancing these important conversations and resources that make a meaningful difference. Before we get started, we'd like to highlight a few other campaigns and events. If you're looking for inspiration, support, or simply a reminder that you're not alone, the THANC Foundation encourages you to visit the THANC Guide and explore the 30 Stories campaign using the link on the left side of the screen. Each April and September, this campaign shares personal stories from cancer survivors and caregivers that offer encouragement, perspective, and connection. On April 1st, the THANC Foundation will also launch the new 30 Stories podcast, creating another way to hear these stories and experiences. In addition, next month, THANC invites you to join another great webinar, Why It's Important to Tell Your Story. You can register now using the link on the right side of the screen. ThyCa is a nonprofit that supports and educates the global thyroid cancer community while also investing in research. Through its website, free medically reviewed handbooks, annual hybrid survivors conference, extensive YouTube library, and wide range of support services, ThyCa helps patients, caregivers, and families find reliable information and connect with others who understand the journey. Their programs include virtual support groups, one-to-one peer connections, online communities, and awareness materials for both patients and medical professionals. Support for people with oral and head and neck cancer, SPOHNC, is a nonprofit organization founded in 1991 by an oral cancer survivor. SPOHNC is dedicated to addressing the medical, physical, psychosocial, and emotional needs of oral and head and neck cancer patients through its many supportive programs and resources. Through a nationwide network of support groups, a one-to-one survivor matching program, educational webinars, and a comprehensive resource library, SPOHNC helps patients, survivors, and caregivers navigate the complexities of diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. SPOHNC is also committed to raising awareness and advocating for improved access to care, including clinical trials, which play a critical role in advancing treatment options and improving patient outcomes. Okay, now we have a brief poll. We'd like to hear from you. Tell us a little bit about your experience with clinical trials. Are you just beginning to learn about clinical trials? Have you looked into trials but have not joined one? Are you currently enrolled in a trial now or have participated in a clinical trial? We'd love to hear where you are in the process or what you'd like to know about. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of people that are just beginning to learn about clinical trials. We've got a few that have looked into them but have not joined any, and some that are enrolled in a trial now and that have participated in a clinical trial as well. It's a great mix. So let's meet our first panelist. Dr. Lowry Wirth has generously shared her time with us today to provide our audience with a better understanding of the clinical trial process. Dr. Wirth, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Genevieve, and hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here doing this with you. Clinical trials are near and dear to my heart. This is what I've been doing for my career in oncology. So I am a medical oncologist in Boston, and I take care of patients with head and neck cancer and with thyroid cancer. And in our center, we do a lot of clinical trials, trying to come up with better treatments for our patients with cancers. So I've been involved in clinical trials for more than 20 years.
Wonderful. Wow, that's quite an extensive experience that you're bringing to this conversation. So I'm so excited today for us and myself to learn more about clinical trials. Um, clinical trials are often described in phases. Can you tell us about what each phase is and what that phase is designed to answer?
Sure. Maybe I'll step back for just one moment and talk a little bit about what goes into launching a clinical trial first, because I think that that's something that's really a black box for most of us, and it's so important. Um, There is so much science that goes into developing a clinical trial long before the clinical trial ever exists in our patients. The amount of scientific work that goes on in cancer cell lines, in cancer animal models, with the basic science looking at proteins and enzymes and DNA is really, there are years in the making of the science that goes into the development of a new drug long before it ever enters into a clinical trial in people. And so while we may be launching a new trial, perhaps a first in human trial or a phase 3 trial, while on its way to development, the amount of information that we already know about that new drug, in terms of its promise for doing a better job taking care of the cancer in which we're studying it, is already really good. So it's not like a new clinical trial is a complete shot in the dark. There's already a lot of promise to a new drug as it's entering into clinical trials. There are different phases of clinical trials. I mentioned the first in human trials. Those are often also referred to as phase 1 trials. And those are usually when a drug hasn't been given to people before, but has been studied preclinically, has been studied in terms of safety and an idea of dosing in humans in animal models, and then enters the phase 1 first in human program. Those studies are done to first and foremost look at the safety of the agent in people, as well as what the best dose in people might be, but also to get an idea of some preliminary efficacy in various cancers in which we hypothesize the drug is going to work in. So while the main goal of first in human phase 1 trials are the proper dose and safety, we're still expecting that there's going to be a signal that the drug works in people. And what that translates to is that ultimately we hope that patients that are enrolling even in those early stage trials will derive some clinical benefit from participating in those trials. When people participate in those trials, it's not only for helping the science and helping other patients with their cancers. We hope that participating in the clinical trial is going to help the patients who are enrolling. One other thing that I'm going to say while I'm thinking about it, which is a little bit of a segue, is that when people do participate in clinical trials, it's such an incredible gift to the mission. It's such a gift to the other patients around the world with their disease. And it's a huge contribution to the science that sometimes I think doesn't get recognized, or we certainly don't recognize often enough and profoundly enough. It's a real profound contribution to the mission. Okay, now getting back to phases. Once we know the proper dosing in people, then usually a drug will move into the phase 2 setting, where we're looking for an early idea of how well does the drug work in particular types of cancers. We often want to get an idea of will the drug work in 45% of people? Will the drug work for a year and a half or 2 years, perhaps, so that we can then go on to a phase 3 trial where we have a well-designed, potentially practice-changing trial that will compare the new agent to the standard of care in a cancer setting and get the kind of data that we need in order to prove that, yes, indeed, the new drug works better than our current standard of care, and it should work, and it works well enough that it should be approved by the FDA and then become available for as the new best standard of care for our patients. So that's sort of the gold standard evidence that we look for the most part, when we're accepting a new drug as a new standard of care.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking us back even to the basics of what is a clinical trial. I just want to bring out a couple of things that you said that just felt really important to me. One is that even before it gets to being a clinical trial used with patients and in patient care, the sort of the context of all the stuff that comes before that, all the research that happens before it even gets to that place to be able to do that. I think that that's such an important piece to really think about, especially when people are trying to decide, is this the right thing for themselves?
Mhm.
I think the other piece that you really brought out, and I would love to have you say a little bit more even about, is the idea of the ways in which that clinical trials matter, not just to, or maybe for both the individual and the advancement of the field. Could
Mhm.
you just expand? I know you meant that as a segue, but I'd love to have you expand a little bit more on that because I think that it's really important as we even consider and think about hope and
Yeah.
legacy and the ways in which that we think about the choices that we're making for our treatment and the ways that that can help and serve others.
Well, yeah, so I think that that phrase that you used, hope and also legacy, really kind of capture both aspects of it. I've heard many times patients say that they wanted to participate in a clinical trial because they wanted to help other people, and that's the legacy piece of it, which is really incredibly generous and impactful. But the hope part is that when I'm off talking with one of my patients about participating in a clinical trial, um, I want that patient to benefit from the therapy that they'll be receiving on the clinical trial, and not do it just for all the other people who we hope to help as well. And one of the things that is almost always true across the board is that um, uh, clinical trials are not the end of the road options for our patients in oncology. I don't, that's not the way that it is, but the way that I think about participation in clinical trials is that for most of our patients, it gives our patients a whole nother treatment option. And it's always better to have another treatment option rather than one less treatment option. So for most cancer situations, there are other standard of care alternatives available to a patient who's being considered for a clinical trial and is considering participating in a clinical trial. However, because of the eligibility criteria and so forth, a clinical trial that might be available to a patient now may very well not be available to that same patient in the future, because of the eligibility criteria and so forth. Whereas if a patient is thinking, well, maybe I'll do the standard of care chemotherapy now and save the clinical trial for later down the road, that doing things in that order is often not an option. Whereas if you do the clinical trial when it is available to you, you've just got that extra option. And if it works, even better. But there's that backup plan of the standard chemotherapy. So I think that that's one of the critical factors that people are often unaware of when thinking about participating in clinical trials.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting. I do think that there's a myth around the idea of clinical trials being something that, oh, I do when I have no other choices left.
Yeah.
And I love this idea and this positioning of when it's available to try to take on that clinical trial, to research and see if you're eligible for it.
Mhm.
Which brings us to, can you tell us a little bit about the criteria for eligibility and measures that are in place to ensure the safety of patients?
Yeah, so safety of patients is always first and foremost built into clinical trials, and there are multiple institutions and mechanisms in place to protect the safety of our human research participants, the IRBs, the FDA. We pay lots of money to our regulatory staff and our clinical trial staff in order to ensure the safety of patients. And so the mechanisms in place to protect patient safety and to ensure the ethical approaches are in place to protect our patients' rights are really a foundation for clinical trials and important at every level of the way that clinical trials are run. And eligibility criteria are one of the safety mechanisms in place. Each clinical trial has eligibility criteria that are pretty much set in stone that define the diagnosis, the disease entity, the setting of where that cancer is in terms of, is it a newly diagnosed cancer? Is it a recurrent cancer? So those are aspects of the eligibility criteria, as well as how well is the person otherwise. So we want to make sure that people have good bone marrow reserve, have a good immune system intact, have good liver function, good kidney function when they're participants in clinical trials. So the eligibility criteria are in part meant to protect people from being at risk if they have other illnesses that might interfere with the care of the clinical trial, as well as to make sure that people that are enrolling in clinical trials really are pretty well otherwise, so that if there's a complication that emerges on the clinical trial, it's not because that patient actually had really bad kidney function to begin with, and that complication really wasn't related to the participation in the study itself.
Well, that makes really good sense.
Mm.
I'm also wondering a little bit about trial endpoints, and why are these important to safety and efficacy?
Mm. Yeah, so there's a well worked out list of endpoints that we use in clinical trials to determine what the right dose is, what the safety profile is of a new agent in that phase one setting, and then how well does it actually really work in cancers in the phase two and phase three setting. We think about, first of all, with phase one studies, um, uh, exposing just a small number of people to the first dose in people, and that first dose is low, making sure that there isn't excess toxicity. And those are defined as dose limiting toxicities. So if you treat a small number of people, they do well for a month or one cycle, then you give another group of people the next dose level up and see is that safe and without a dose limiting toxicity, and so on and so forth, until you get to what you think is going to be an effective dose in people that also is safe. So that usually we consider the maximally tolerated dose or the recommended phase two dose. Now, in phase two trials, we think about objective response rate. That's usually an important endpoint in phase two trials, where we want to see how many patients who are treated with this new therapy will have their cancers shrink up. So if cancers shrink in a meaningful way, that would be a partial response. If there's evidence of the cancer completely responding to therapy, that's a complete response. An objective response rate are those two two response rates together. Patients can also have stable disease. If somebody has metastatic disease and it's growing and the drug is well tolerated and it stops that growth, that can be a really meaningful improvement in the overall situation as well. And that's called stable disease. Now, if the cancer is growing anyway, that's called progressive disease, and often that's a sign that that drug isn't working in that cancer, and it might not make sense to continue. So that's objective response rate. We also, particularly in phase 3 trials or randomized controlled trials, care a lot about progression-free survival and overall survival. The definition of progression-free survival is a little bit complicated if you read it on paper. However, it's basically how well are people doing in terms of their cancer not growing and the patient staying alive. Together, that's progression-free survival.
Mm.
And then overall survival is basically, are people alive or no longer alive? And so we want to look for statistically significant differences in both of those two endpoints to know that a new drug is truly better than the standard of care in that particular setting.
So much of this comes back to what you spoke about really early on, even in the level of attention to the details of the eligibility and the endpoint and the safety measures that really are wrapped around the whole process. And I think that feels like a really important information to get out of this. Sort of all of the safety measures that wrap around the whole entire process from even before the beginning to the end,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We did talk about one of the misconceptions about clinical trials. Are there others?
So a big one, of course, is placebo. So many people are afraid that if they enroll in a clinical trial, they might get a placebo. Now, that can happen. There are some studies that are done with placebo, but in oncology, a lot of studies are not done with placebo at all. And of course, a placebo is a sugar pill or a dummy pill that isn't an active therapeutic agent or the study agent. But phase 1 and phase 2 trials usually don't have placebos at all. In the phase 3 setting, in oncology, there almost is never an arm that is only placebo, where the patient isn't getting anything but a dummy pill. Usually in a phase 3 trial in oncology, there's the new therapy that we think will be better, but we still are not 100% sure without the phase 3 data. And that's compared to the standard of care. And the standard of care arm may be, whatever the standard of care, could be immunotherapy plus chemotherapy together. It could be an oral targeted therapy. And sometimes that might be plus a placebo. But it's almost never just a placebo. So definitely ask, is it possible that I'll get a placebo when you're talking with your doctor about participating in a clinical trial? But it's almost never the case that somebody's only going to get a placebo.
Mm. Thank you. That's really important. Because I could see how that would also be a little disconcerting to somebody. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that no matter what somebody is getting the standard of care, or they're getting whatever medication is being tested for research. Am I correct? Am I clarifying? Am I saying that correctly?
So in phase 3 trials, yes, that's usually the case. Yeah, yeah. And then one thing that I'll add is a lot of phase 3 trials are also designed so that to stack the deck in the participants' favor in terms of having an opportunity to get the experimental agent, because we do think that the experimental arm is going to be the better arm. Otherwise, we wouldn't do the trial. And so some studies have incorporated in the design a 2-to-1 ratio in terms of randomization to the experimental arm versus the standard of care arm. So for every 3 people, 2 of the 3 people would get the experimental arm compared to the standard of care arm. Or phase 3 studies might also incorporate a crossover arm so that if the patient is enrolled in the standard of care arm and then their cancer grows and progresses, then they are offered to receive the experimental agent in an open label crossover part of the trial. Clinical trials have these kinds of methodologies built into them to try to make what we think is going to be the better drug available to as many people as possible.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying all of that. It's a lot of information, so
I
it's a little
know.
overwhelming at times. So I appreciate the ways in which that you're really simplifying it for people and bringing it to a place where anyone can really understand. How do clinical trials expand treatment options for patients?
Well, again, I think that the way that clinical trials expand treatment options is that they take the science that a lot of really smart scientists have been working on for a number of years and bring it from the bench to the bedside to give a participant an opportunity to be on what may be the next best treatment option for them. And there are some parts of the world where more people with cancer or a higher percentage of cancer patients participate in clinical trials in the US. We don't have enough of our patients in the US participating in clinical trials. And I think we really need to push that message as much as possible. And the reason why it's so important is because the hypothesis behind the drug working well in the patient population is always very sound. It always doesn't work, but the hypothesis and the science behind something that makes it into a clinical trial is always very good science. And so the opportunity for people to potentially benefit from a drug that's being studied in a clinical trial is really very significant.
We're going to move to talking a little bit about funding.
Mhm.
Why is funding essential to launching and sustaining clinical trials?
Funding is absolutely critical here. The amount of dollars that it takes to do all of that science and then to do the first in human trials, to take it all the way to the phase 3 trials that are going to lead to FDA approval, it's incredibly expensive. Um, there are there is a lot of money that goes into this endeavor from the pharmaceutical industry. And this is one aspect where capitalism can work really well because the pharmaceutical industry can make a lot of money when they have a new drug that works really well in cancer. The problem is that there are a lot of really important questions that need to be answered about a new drug that might not enhance the profit of the company, and therefore those clinical trials are harder to get funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And so that's where a cooperative group clinical trials comes in that are supported by the federal government. The problem is that the amount of funding for cooperative group trials made available by the federal government doesn't nearly cover the huge need in that area. So it's very difficult to move the needle forward with a new agent, say that's already been FDA approved in one setting, but there are three other really important cancer questions in other settings. To get funding that's adequate to do those trials is very challenging. And the cooperative group mechanism exists, but it's not sufficient. And one thing that I would say that's particularly relevant here for this audience is that that's even more true in rare tumors. It's hard to find funding from government and from the pharmaceutical industry to study a new cancer drug in a rare tumor. And that's where I think philanthropy really is important because there just isn't enough funding available, and there's not enough money to be made in order to easily have access to great new drugs for rare tumor types. And it's very difficult to study rare tumor types in one center because of the rarity of the disease. So you need to have a big enterprise to show that a new drug works in a rare tumor, for example, adenoid cystic carcinoma. And so there are a lot of studies that are funded through philanthropic mechanisms for rare tumors. And that support is really absolutely critical.
Mm. How have the federal funding cuts affected clinical trials that you're involved in?
Well, this is a problem. Um, the It's from soup to nuts. Unfortunately, the one of the biggest concerns is the federal funding cuts to support the basic sciences, particularly in academia. The fundamental discoveries that lead to new breakthrough therapies more often than not are made not by the pharmaceutical industry, but in academic medical centers where we have really smart physician scientists or PhD scientists working in their basic and translational labs, coming up with brand new ideas and showing that there's a there. Then those good ideas then make their way to the pharmaceutical industry, where there's enough funding to really support development further into actual getting the drugs available to humans. But the early discovery, the kernels of the science that are really the most important aspect, that kind of funding is significantly in jeopardy. There's one other really important thing, which is complicated, but there was legislation during the Biden era that was meant to make costs of drugs for people less. But one of the unintended consequences of that IRA funding was that it actually made it less attractive for the pharmaceutical industry to study new drugs in uncommon cancer types because of the way that the regulatory environment was changed by that legislation. So that's an important aspect that hinders the development of new drugs in rare cancers that hopefully at some point in the future we'll be able to change.
Yeah, hope so. Moving on to talking with your doctor. And I'm going to, if Jeff and Dan have contributions to this kind of the conversation, I will introduce you guys at some point. We'll bring you in right after this part. But this next question might apply to you guys also. What are some key questions to ask your care team about clinical trials?
So finding out about clinical trials is hard for me. I can't imagine how I would do it if I were a patient. One key step I think is before cancer treatment is started, a good question always is, hey, is there a clinical trial that I should be aware of that I might want to consider? If you've already started a therapy, and then learn about a sexy clinical trial that you want to participate in. If you've already started therapy, then you might not be eligible.
Mm.
So before a new fork in the road, always ask about a clinical trial. And if your doctor says, "Oh, I don't think that there is anything," then say, "Well, how can you and I together make sure that there isn't something important that I might want to know about?" And it's hard for everybody in the business, whether it's an APP or a doctor, to stop what they're doing and put the time into investigating in investigating what clinical trial options might be available. There are some newer resources that are available for both patients and physicians, but it's a very information dense area, and it's really hard to do that basic homework. But patients shouldn't be shy about asking their doctor more than once for help along these lines.
Excellent.
I let me just interject here because I think in this era of 2026, we're very fortunate that AI is starting to come into its own because, again, depending on which large language model you use, the ability to decipher tremendous amounts of information and be able to specify exactly what it is you're looking for, what cancer type you have, even to the extent of the mutations and drivers. The AI can do a tremendous job in narrowing down possible clinical trials, where they're located, who the contact people are. So in that regard, we are fortunate right now.
Mm.
My situation is just the opposite. My oncologist asked me to search for a clinical trial, and I didn't know anything about it. So, yeah, we were on the other end of that. So I did the research. I went to the clinicaltrials.gov site, which is very doctor oriented, and I believe it still is. I was diagnosed back in 2011, so that's. And then I didn't do the search until 2014, but still, AI was not part of the situation. So yeah, doing the search was a bit crazy, but I found like 7 and handed them to the doctor, and then he went through them one by one, and we picked one.
Great.
I would also add, in my experience, I seem to have been on both ends of the question of when do you do a clinical trial? I participated in a clinical trial in 2023, and it was at a point where it was the end of the line. There were no other choices. Fortunately, I did meet the criteria, and literally within a matter of days, I was in the clinical trial, which was adding an immunotherapy drug that was in phase 2 to targeted therapy. And it worked tremendously. I showed tremendous progression from it, which really shrunk the tumor. And then we were able to eradicate it by chemoradiation. I'm 2.5 years post that clinical trial. And I don't know what would have happened if I didn't have that clinical trial. I did ask my oncologist and said, what's going to happen if I don't participate in this clinical trial? And he said, you're going to end up suffocating. And that wasn't an attractive option. I asked, could I at least have a heart attack? Because I really didn't want to suffocate. But moving forward, I was diagnosed back in 2015 with stage 4 thyroid cancer. So I knew it was only a matter of when, not if, reoccurrences would occur. And they reoccurred in 22 and 23. I'm 2.5 years post-treatment. But one of the areas of my metastasis was to my lungs, which is very common in papillary thyroid cancer. And it seems that they're starting to get a little more aggressive right now. So there is some clinical trials that are available. One I may not be eligible for because of prior targeted therapy treatment, but using AI sources, I did a lot of digging to find out what other maybe big pharmas or what other clinical trials using comparable drugs. My mutation driver is BRAF positive, which fortunately does have some very successful targeted therapy. But now you've got these pharmaceutical companies that are coming out with second and third generation BRAF inhibitors. So in this case, my option is to stick with, current standard of care targeted therapy for BRAF positive papillary thyroid cancer. Or if I can get into one of these clinical trials, to go the clinical trial route before I look at the standard of care. So I may be at both ends of the spectrum on this one.
Daniel, you're incredibly knowledgeable, so I'm glad that we have you here today. Both of you are really sharing, just hearing your own experiences and how you asked about or how you were given opportunities to sort of find out more about clinical trials, I think is really important. I just want to mention, we're going to mention them again at the end, but I just want to mention before we go on that there are two sort of websites that you can use to help you look for clinical trials. One is CareBox Connect, and the other one is Massive Bio. Those we're going to share with those also later in the webinar, but I just wanted to bring those up here because it seemed like it was part of our conversation right now. I would like to thank Dr. Wirth for helping us better understand the clinical trials, how they work, why they could be such an important part of cancer care. Your insights and practical guidance have given us a strong foundation, and I really appreciate the ways in which that you're breaking down some really difficult ideas into language that we all can understand. I know that can be, this is really challenging, and so I really appreciate your ability to do that.
Thank you.
Want to shift, though, over to the lived experience of our other two guests today by introducing two cancer survivors. So Dan Rosenfield and Jeff Shoop, and who can share what it's actually like to consider and participate in a clinical trial and what they learned along the way. I'm going to start with Jeff. Can you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and at what point in your treatment you started a clinical trial?
Okay. I was diagnosed in 2011 with stage 4 HPV squamous cell cancer, oral pharyngeal. And I had the standard treatment of 35 radiations and chemo. And 2 years later, every year you get a follow-up, and my second follow-up, they found that it metastasized to my lung. So my doctor said I had enough radiation for the moment, and he suggested a clinical trial, which I had no clue what that was. So he told me about it, and my wife and I were always asking 1,000 questions. So I think that gave him the opportunity to suggest that we go look for a clinical trial. So that's what we did. And like I mentioned earlier, I found, 7, 9 different trials. It would be very helpful to know your diagnosis, know the clinical terms when you go and search. So anyways, I handed him the different variations, and I tell the story that it's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. He went, this is not for you. We already did this, it went down through too soft, too hot, whatever. And he finally picked one. It was a brand new immunotherapy, never been done before. And it was so new, it didn't have a name. It had a number. So it was a phase 2 trial. And my word of the day back then was persistence. You have to be very persistent in asking questions, following up. And if it wasn't for my persistence and my doctor, the actual clinical trial doctor, her persistence, we wouldn't be talking today. So my intro into it was a little bumpy. We can get into that if you want to. But so anyways, it was a 2-year trial. I had 2 options. I could either go to Philly or to Baltimore. So that was nice. They were about the same distance for me. So I picked one. I picked the Johns Hopkins. And then About halfway into the trial, they found that the drug was working and got rid of my tumors. And so since 2015, I've been cancer free from that experimental drug, which is now known as Pembro or pembrolizumab. So that worked out for me, and that's pretty much long and short of it. There's a lot more to tell, but I won't go into it.
Dan, we heard a little bit about your story. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, but maybe you could also tell us a little bit about what were some of the factors that you considered when you were making the decision about your clinical trial. Like, did you think about was there travel involved, the intensity or side effects, or the ways in which that it might affect your family?
Sure. Well, fortunately, I live in the suburbs of New York City, not far from the major cancer centers. And, clearly we had to drive down to the city on multiple occasions. I think in 2023, we must have made about 80 trips down to New York City for a variety of reasons, including hospitalization. But as I said earlier, I had been through quite a lot with the thyroid cancer. And as Jeff said, you really have to be your own advocate. You've got to take extensive notes. You've got to know the vocabulary. Genetic composition of your tumor is critical to everything that you are going to need to know going forward with treatment. In 2015, I received a regular radioactive iodine. I received a very large dose. Here it is 11 years later, and they're saying if you're BRAF positive, you shouldn't get radioactive iodine because it probably won't do any good. And it probably did more harm than good. But at the time, the cancer center wanted to do external radiation beam therapy, and I consulted with a lot of different doctors, experts, some of which had written the guidelines, and they recommended against it at the time. And the reason for that is once you radiated, the surgical option, if you have a recurrence, becomes very difficult for the surgeon to be able to do what he needs to do. So I didn't have the radiation, which allowed me to have it in 2023 when I really needed it. In 22, I had a recurrence, and I saw the 5 top head and neck cancer surgeons in New York City, and they all wanted to do a complete laryngectomy. Obviously, if that was the case, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. I'd be using hand signals. But I found one doctor in New York City who was prepared to do a very, very unique and rare operation, which succeeded. Subsequently, I had a third recurrence where my papillary thyroid cancer mutated to anaplastic, which 3 years ago would have been a death sentence. I was immediately put on these BRAF inhibitors, and then they were plateauing. And at that point, my oncologist said, we do have a clinical trial. We're going to add immunotherapy. It's the only chance you really have. So I had no choice at that point. I had already climbed on the bus, so to speak, and I was going to see where it was going to take me. My experience with the clinical trial drug, and again, I still have a dispute with my oncologist as to what caused the side effects that I had, but they were brutal. I was getting an infusion every 3 weeks, and within 24 hours of getting that infusion, I was still taking the BRAF targeted therapy inhibitors plus the immunotherapy. I would start getting cycles that would last for 7 to 10 days of fevers and chills, complete with what's called rigors, which is this uncontrollable shaking. I mean, I could be under a down blanket with a mattress warmer and a down jacket on and a beanie cap, and I would just be shaking endlessly. And then that would pass, and then I would start developing a high fever. And for me, I had what's called a fistula, which is an opening between the esophagus and the trachea. So the doctors were always concerned about a aspirational pneumonia. So there was a question, was I getting the fever from the drugs? Was I getting the fever from an infection? Of course, they wanted me to go down to the hospital. I felt they were always chasing a ghost. I felt I never really had aspirational pneumonia. I felt it was really drug combinations. And after 15 weeks of, it was torture. It was very difficult to get through it, but I've got 4 grandsons and I really wanted to be able to ski with them and play with them and teach them golf and whatever else that kept me going. And on top of that, my wife is a doll. The caregiver in this situation is so critical because I required a lot of care. I had lost 32 pounds. I lost 100% of my muscularity, and I was an extreme athlete. I'm still trying to get back to it. I ended up with a PEG, a gastric feeding tube, for over a year. So all my nutrition was coming from a syringe. I called it my life, 60 milliliters at a time. But I still did enjoy my Coca-Cola and Gatorade. So after 5 infusions over 15 weeks, I said to my oncologist, I said, I'm done. I don't know that I can do another 3 weeks of this because it was brutal. It was hard. I just got to tell you, Jeff, you said perseverance. You got to have some really strong mental and physical fortitude to go through any cancer treatment, especially when you're stage 4. Yeah. So the good news was that the fistula had closed. My voice was coming back because the tumor was pressing against my one functioning vocal cord. And the tumor was getting, not to the point of microscopic, but it was almost unseeable on the scans. And that's when I did the chemoradiation, which eradicated it. So it's been a long journey, but I'm about to start round 4 because we have to finally deal with these lung nodules.
I certainly hope you don't mean that your cola and Gatorade were mixed together, but that those are 2 separate drinks. But that's so thank you for sharing your story and in such great detail. It does make me think though, and for you, Jeff, also, where were the moments of hope, or where did you find hope? And who helped you? And Dan, you spoke about your wife and the challenges that she faced, also being part of our caregivers are part of this process.
Right.
How do they support your decision-making process?
Well, my wife is definitely the rock. We eventually gave her a name of NB1. I won't say what that is, but it's Nurse Astrid. She made me drink the water, stay hydrated. She made all my food. Most of the time, a lot of head and neck patients that get their radiation need a feeding tube. And I was one of those that needed a feeding tube. And she made all the food and strained it. So I got real food to go through the feeding tube. I was a little more than Dan. I lost 60 pounds during my treatment. But my wife and my family were definitely an integral part of the healing and positive aspect. Staying positive is, wow, I can't tell you how important that is. A gentleman I met who was a member of our local SPOHNC group, our head and neck support group, he was my mentor going through this. And he said, you're going to have some really bad days. Well, I did never have a bad day. I wouldn't let it. So my SPOHNC contacts, all the people in the group were very, very supportive. I had a lot of questions because back then there was a lot of gray. You didn't know what to expect. And having that resource was very helpful in the recovery aspect of it. Knowing what to do or what to try or what not to try, that kind of a thing. The nurse navigators were wonderful, wonderful. So I would say keeping a positive attitude through your treatment. I also added one other thing for myself. I remember back when I was a child, I would get injured and I have to go get a tetanus shot. And I would always tense up before they gave me the shot. And then it would hurt like a dickens for days later, right? So I decided that when I went to get my treatments, I would accept them. I would just accept the treatment. Whatever it is, I'm taking it. Give it to me. And I think that positive aspect helped my whole mental process and help me move forward. And so I got lots to tell you, but I'm going to keep it short. But
I think
the treatments, the original ones, they're tough ones. As Dan said, they're tough.
Yeah.
The immunotherapy part that I had in my clinical trial was a walk in the park compared to the original protocol. But to Dr. Wirth's comment about that the trials are not the end of the road, my doctors did explain that to me. They said, look, you had this treatment, now there's a clinical trial. If it works, great, you keep going. If it doesn't work, by the time it doesn't work, there might be another clinical trial. And then you keep trying. Or you can go back to the original protocol for treatment. So there was never there was no light at the end of the tunnel. There was always something to look forward to or to try to go towards. So again, we're back to the positive attitude and staying honest with yourself in the treatment process. So.
Yeah, I think the idea of sort of accepting the medication, thinking of it also as like, this is helping me, this
Yep.
is helping my body,
Yep.
as opposed to some of the other framing that is out there around cancer treatments that may or may not be helpful to people to
Yeah.
think.
Well, the one other thing too, if you go to a SPOHNC meeting or one of your support meetings, what I found when I first went there is I looked around and there were so many people still around. Because I thought, having a metastasized to my lung and going on through all this, that was not a good sign. But, that was 2014.
Yeah.
I'm still here.
I would add a couple of more things. I think knowledge is empowering. And I made it a point to do my research. I never went to a doctor's meeting without a list of questions and make sure I got my answers. But even when I was being hospitalized, I would be questioning everything because, people are busy, people make mistakes, but I always knew what was going on. And secondarily, and I know some people like to be stoic, I was in extreme pain. My neck was in really bad shape. Only from here to here, everything else was great. And the narcotics helped tremendously. As I said, there are a lot of people who are stoic about that. I don't want to get addicted. I don't need to take, morphine or oxycodone or whatever it is. But if I had to use my energy, which was already so depleted, fighting the pain rather than fighting the cancer and being able to do my research, it would have been very detrimental not to have taken those drugs when they were available. Yeah. So that's what I throw out there. The other thing is I've been an extreme athlete for 30 or 40 years. So everything from scuba diving, heli skiing, adventure racing. I'm a 5th degree black belt in karate. So I already have a certain mindset that I can get through things. So yeah, you got to have that.
You can do it. Yeah. No, absolutely. There's a question for you, Dan. Which was the AI that you used to get best results?
Am I allowed to say it? I've been using Perplexity. I know a lot of people use a lot of different AIs, whether it's Gemini or Claude, but I've gotten very comfortable with it. I like the footnotes they provide. A lot of the AIs today just seem like they want to please you and are biased in that regard. But I have found it a tremendous tool.
Excellent. Thank you. And Dr. Wirth, we've got a couple questions. How do you know if you're BRAF positive, and how long does each clinical trial last?
Well, so BRAF V600E mutations are fairly common in papillary thyroid cancer, anaplastic thyroid cancer, and there is testing that can be done on an old tumor specimen from a prior surgery or a prior biopsy that your doctor can order. There are two different kinds of tests, basically. One is what's called an immunohistochemistry, which can be done in most pathology labs and just takes a couple of days to get results. And a more definitive test that can provide additional information is what's referred to as NGS testing, or next generation sequencing. And that's where a tumor specimen from the archives, pulled from the archives, they extract the DNA from the cancer, and then you can analyze the DNA from the cancer to see what types of mutations might be present, driving that the growth of that cancer. There are many different types of cancers that are driven by driver alterations like BRAF that are druggable with drugs that are FDA approved or drugs that are being studied in clinical trials. And you don't know if your tumor has one of those mutations or not unless the tumor gets tested. And there isn't a high enough frequency of testing of cancers for those potentially actionable gene alterations in our medical universe right now. It's possible that it's been done and you don't know about it. It's also possible that it hasn't been done, but your doctor can order it if it hasn't been done. The second question was about the length of clinical trials. Yeah. For the most part, most studies will be indefinite. The way that patient participation in a clinical trial is determined in terms of the length is as long as the person is tolerating the therapy well enough and the cancer isn't growing in a meaningful way, then they'll stay on whatever therapy is being investigated in the clinical trial. There's some courses of treatment, like what Dan got, actually Jeff had as well, a 7-week course of chemotherapy with radiation. And that's, if you're looking at a new drug that might help radiation work better, then that would be a 7-week treatment period. But if it's a trial that somebody is enrolling on because they have a metastatic cancer, generally the therapy will continue as long as the patient is tolerating it and their cancer isn't growing.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for Demystifying Clinical Trials, What Patients Need to Know, which is a joint partnership between THANC, ThyCa, and SPOHNC. We're so grateful to our panelists today for sharing their experience, expertise, and thoughtful insights. This has been an incredibly important and empowering discussion. As a bonus for attending today's session, you will receive a link to the full recording and the slide deck, which you can share with anyone who may benefit. We'll also include additional trusted resources to help you continue exploring clinical trials with confidence. Be sure to keep an eye out for that follow-up email. For patients and caregivers looking for clinical trials, here are 2 tools that may help make the search process easier. CareBox Connect and Massive Bio both aim to help people find relevant cancer clinical trials more efficiently by combining technology with support to guide them through the process. CareBox offers a free, easy-to-use tool that helps patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals explore clinical trials based on a patient's diagnosis and treatment history. By answering a few simple questions, users can quickly see trials that may be relevant and available to them. If you're looking for inspiration, support, or simply a reminder that you're not alone, the THANC Foundation encourages you to visit the THANC Guide and explore the 30 Stories campaign using the link on the left side of the screen. Each April and September, this campaign shares personal stories from cancer survivors and caregivers that offer encouragement, perspective, and connection. On April 1st, the THANC Foundation will also launch the new 30 Stories podcast, creating another way to hear those voices and experiences. In addition, next month, THANC invites you to join another great webinar, Why It's Important to Tell Your Story. You can register now using the link on the right side of the screen. ThyCa is a nonprofit that supports and educates the global thyroid cancer community while also investing in research. Through its website, free medically reviewed handbook, annual Hybrid Survivors Conference, extensive YouTube library, and a wide range of support services, ThyCa helps patients, caregivers, and families find reliable information and connect with others who understand the journey. Their programs include virtual support groups, one-on-one peer connections, online communities, and awareness materials for both patients and medical professionals. Support for Patients with Oral and Head and Neck Cancer, SPOHNC, is a nonprofit organization founded in 1991 by an oral cancer survivor. SPOHNC is dedicated to addressing the medical, physical, psychosocial, and emotional needs of oral head and neck cancer patients through its many supportive programs and resources. Through a nationwide network of support groups, a one-to-one survivor matching program, educational webinars, and a comprehensive resource library, SPOHNC helps patients, survivors, and caregivers navigate the complexities of diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. SPOHNC is also committed to raising awareness and advocating for improved access to care, including clinical trials, which play a critical role in advancing treatment options and improving patient outcomes. Again, we'd like to take a moment to recognize the sponsors of today's webinar, ASI and Bicara, for supporting today's discussion. Their dedication to empowering patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals helps drive meaningful conversation with a lasting impact. Thank you once again for joining today's discussion. We hope you found it inspiring and helpful as you navigate your own journey. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you again for our next webinar in April.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.